A few months ago, my Aunt Lucy, who has been a long-time friend of my mom's, managed to beat cancer after a long, difficult, and very painful battle. She truly won this fight. When she told my mom the news, it was the first time I saw her cry and let out a scream of pure happiness. A curious sound that seemed like pain, but soon turned into uncontrollable laughter. Days later, they organized a big party, attended not only by family and her friends, but also by everyone who supported her throughout those years of struggle in which she never gave up. My older sister couldn't go, but she left Gabriel, my 3-year-old nephew, with us. We took him to the party because, according to my mum, there would definitely be other kids, which she used as an argument when I complained, knowing that, as always, the responsibility of looking after him would fall solely on me. Fortunately, at the party, he soon found a room where another little boy was playing, and the two began to have fun on their own. However, when they started playing hide and seek, I kept an eye on them from outside, as I wanted to make sure he didn't go exploring. Every time he left the room, I watched to ensure he didn't wander too far before he returned to where he was. The house seemed very peaceful inside, but outside, in the community where we were, it had a creepy atmosphere, almost like a haunted house. The party took place in that house far from the city, which belonged to an aunt of my Aunt Lucy. I didn't know much about her family, but it was clear that at least there was quite a bit of money involved. The house was primarily made of stone and refined wood, with an air of old luxury. From the moment we approached the entrance, I told my mum that the place looked like it was straight out of a horror movie. That's why I didn't want to let Gabriel out of sight, since he's very mischievous and always ends up hiding. While he was playing inside, I suddenly heard the sound of a slap, and immediately after, I saw Gabriel coming out of the room, crying and holding his face. I asked him what happened, and he told me the boy he was playing with had hit him. So off I went after the boy to get an explanation. As soon as I entered the room, I turned on the light to ask why he had done that, and I saw him slipping through a wooden door. I didn't know where it led, but I didn't intend to follow him. I signaled to my mom, who was approaching, probably alerted by Gabriel's crying. Lucy also arrived. I told them that the boy had hit Gabriel and then ran to that door, but that I didn't want to follow him since I didn't know what was on the other side. Before my mom could react, Lucy asked me if I had seen the boy or if Gabriel had only told me about him. I replied that yes, I had clearly seen him playing with Gabriel and entering that door when I went to talk to him. Lucy approached, opened the door, and inside was a tiny space, almost like an empty pantry. There was no one inside, and it was impossible for anyone to have left. There were only 3 closed walls. We left the party immediately, all of us frightened, especially me and my mum, and of course we didn't say anything to Gabriel. The curious part came later when my mum told me what Lucy had said. It turns out ghost stories have always circulated about that house, but Lucy had never seen anything. Since childhood, she had never experienced anything strange until the time she went there very sick, in the peak of her cancer battle when she thought she wouldn't survive. She told us that during this period, a boy, like the one I saw, and a very frightening old woman frequently appeared to her. She described this woman as an elderly lady with long grey hair, black eyes, who wandered around the house in the dark, holding a candle. Her aunt, the owner of the house, told her to ignore it, arguing that it was just an effect of the illness. But what's most intriguing is that nowadays, children who visit the house also see this boy, though only very young ones. Lucy was genuinely shaken, not so much by the fact that Gabriel saw him, but by the fact that he managed to touch him, to make contact with the boy. And what surprised her most was that now, at 17 years old, I could also see him. It's as if whatever emerged during that painful time hadn't disappeared with her recovery, as she thought it would. On the contrary, it seems to be growing stronger. What do you think about this, folks? I would love to read your opinions here in the comments. Well, let's continue. My story may be quite short, and perhaps it doesn't have the same depth as those usually told here. But a friend suggested that I share it, so here I am, narrating what was, without a doubt, the most frightening experience I have ever lived through. I'm a flight attendant, and although I can't disclose the airline, I usually work on international flights. This happened 2 years ago on one of my first flights to Spain, and it was also my first time doing this route. At the last minute, a young Spanish man boarded, and we were asked to wait for him. He seemed to be an important person. He was just over 30, very handsome and extremely polite, something I must admit I don't always expect to find in passengers with that profile. Generally, people with an air of status and from a good family are more distant, not always treating us with much attention. But this one was different, captivating and attentive. He even made a few jokes with the crew, and his presence made the flight lighter every time we approached him to offer service. As we disembarked, he approached me and 2 colleagues, suggesting that if we still had energy that night, we could visit a nightclub owned by his friends. He assured us that if we went, we would be well received as thanks for our service during the flight. The 3 of us were young, relatively new to the job, and excited to explore Madrid. So, that very night, we remembered the invitation from the mysterious young man. I'll call him Eduardo, although I know this is not a name he would use publicly. We were close to the location, so at a certain point in the evening we decided to go. At the entrance we said what he had instructed us, that we were his guests. We were immediately allowed entry and taken to a separate table, a complete VIP area. After some time, when we were already considering leaving, Eduardo suddenly appeared, visibly thrilled to see us and know that we had accepted his invitation. He seemed genuinely surprised, as if he really thought we wouldn't show up. It was a strange sensation. The confidence and charm he had displayed on the flight had given way to an unexpected shyness. He was genuinely grateful for our presence, which intrigued me. After all, he was the type who could have whatever he wanted. After warmly greeting us, he left for a while, asking us not to leave just yet. It was late when he returned, and my friends were exhausted, trying to convince me to leave. At that moment, Eduardo took my hand and asked me to stay a little longer, promising he would take me to the hotel afterward. The idea of getting to know him better seemed appealing. After all, he was an enigmatic figure. I have to confess, back then I was quite inexperienced, and in a way, I trusted people like him more, millionaires, as if they were incapable of anything terrible. What could happen? What would be the worst outcome, I thought? Single, flirting with a charming Spanish multimillionaire. Honestly, who wouldn't have accepted staying a little longer? Eventually, early in the morning, he suggested we go to his house. When I was about to decline, he assured me that nothing needed to happen, that the house was huge, and I could sleep in one of the rooms. In the morning, he would take me back to the hotel after breakfast. I agreed. I remember the car that pulled up next to us perfectly. Although I don't know much about models, that winged emblem on the hood was unmistakable. It was a Rolls-Royce. When the driver opened the door for us, Eduardo hung back a bit, apparently saying goodbye to someone. I recall the moment when the driver extended his hand to help me in, asking if I was tired or a bit tipsy. I answered that I wasn't. He then offered to take me to the hotel if I preferred, and I insisted that everything was fine, that we were going to Eduardo's house. It was then that, with a serious look, he told me much more than any words could express. If at any moment you'd prefer to go to the hotel, just let us know, okay? There was something unsettling in the way he looked at me, almost pleading with me to give up and leave, but I didn't understand. When we finally got into the car, I looked for a sign in Eduardo to restore my sense of safety, something to dispel the warning feeling conveyed by the driver. However, I noticed another change in him. He was no longer the confident young man I had met on the plane, nor the shy guy from the nightclub. Before me, he seemed just a boy, insecure, sitting on the other side of the seat, almost unable to complete his sentences. I was about to ask to be taken to the hotel when he said a firm no. At that instant, his gaze shifted, becoming almost menacing, only to soften again and return to the charming tone that captivated us during the flight. Forgive me, it's been a rough day. My medication affects my mood, but I'm fine. At least they helped me quit drinking and I feel better, you know. Much healthier. I hope you didn't find me unpleasant. It's okay, I replied. I just thought maybe you were tired and preferred to rest. I didn't know the city, but it was clear by the route we took that we were no longer in Madrid. We entered an area where the houses were massive, bigger than I could imagine. That young man was undoubtedly from a much more important family than I had supposed. We traveled across a vast estate, following a driveway that led us to a monumental house, like those seen in movies. Then we went up a bit more and stopped in front of another house, much smaller, though it still looked like a real mansion to me. "Here I am. It's where I live so as not to bother my family with my stuff," he said, looking distant as the car door was opened for us. "My family doesn't have much patience with me anymore," he added, smiling. As he said this, he touched his temple, as if indicating his head, and I wondered if perhaps he suffered from depression or something similar, and that his family simply didn't want to deal with these issues. At that moment, I felt a mix of pity and empathy for him. As soon as we exited the car, he hurried into the house, and I found it strange that he hadn't waited for me. It was a somewhat rude gesture, quite different from the behavior he had shown before. However, when the driver handed me my coat, he muttered something that I almost didn't catch, but it seemed like, "The car will be ready at the door the entire time." Upon entering, I heard Eduardo shouting to someone, announcing his arrival. I asked if there was anyone else in the house, and he replied that no, I didn't need to worry, he was only talking to the dogs. He said I didn't need to be afraid, as they were locked up, as they could get a bit aggressive when excited. I settled in a room where he opened the windows to reveal a spectacular view. He mentioned he would go change into something more comfortable, as he had something special to show me. While I waited, I started to hear an insistent sound, the dogs scratching at the door where they were locked, releasing desperate whimpers. I shouted to Eduardo to let them out, explaining that I was used to large dogs. I grew up in a home with a Rottweiler and a Great Dane, so I wouldn't scare easily. Eduardo came down quickly with a look of excitement on his face. He asked if I would like to play with them, and I replied yes, that I was eager for it. "Great," he said before giving a slight kick to the door as if he wanted to push them back or as if he were handling wild animals. That bothered me. Soon after, he opened the door and pushed it. It was a heavy door and barely moved. "Well, I'll finish changing. Wait for them to come out slowly. I'll be back to join you," he said hurriedly before going back upstairs. I waited for the dogs to come out, expecting them to burst out with energy and ready to play, but nothing happened. I called for them a few times in a friendly tone, but there was no response. I returned to the living room and sat with my back to the door, trying to give them a safer environment to come out in case they were scared. Still, they continued scratching at the door, letting out low whines that echoed sadness. The house was submerged in darkness. The only light came from a small lamp in the living room. I felt a certain sadness thinking about the dogs trapped in that darkness, but I imagined they might be asleep. Even so, I went to the door of that room, ready to call them. I never miss a chance to play with a dog. In the dark, on a luxurious leather couch, something seemed to play. They were large figures, one much bigger than me, and another smaller, closer to my size. They were engrossed in each other, but upon seeing me, they turned toward me. They were two people locked in there wearing hyper-realistic dog costumes. But as I watched them get up and on all fours move awkwardly toward me, it became clear that they were really people. I ran out, and to my surprise, there was no car at the entrance as promised. But in the distance, I saw a figure in front of the main house, the large one. I sprinted down to him and said I needed to get out of there. The man, who must have been over 70, was washing another Rolls-Royce. He looked behind me toward that house with a look of disgust and told me to get in the car quickly. I noticed, at the door of the house I had just left, the dogs watching me. "Don't look back at what you just escaped from," he said. He asked where I wanted to go, and I gave the hotel address. I mentioned that Eduardo's driver had promised he'd always be waiting at the door, and the man just laughed as if mocking my naivety. I didn't quite understand what had happened, and the driver didn't say another word. He drove me to the hotel in complete silence. I also didn't ask anything. I was confused and increasingly dizzy, almost to the point of feeling nauseous. I grabbed my phone to message my friends, perhaps share my location, but the phone was off. I didn't know since when. I couldn't even remember the last time I had looked at it. When I arrived at the hotel, I found my friends awake, very worried. It seems that someone, after seeing me leave with Eduardo, warned them that I was in danger. that I was getting involved in something truly dark. I felt immense gratitude to be back with them, and I spent a good amount of time without going out in the cities we visited, and even more, without trusting strangers. Do you want to know what was stranger? Almost a year later, back in Spain, one of these friends showed me a celebrity magazine, one of those that talk about socialites and high society. She opened it to a page of a recent event. I felt a chill seeing Eduardo in the photo, along with his family. They were all tall, beautiful, happy. But he looked isolated from the others, without contact, with a worn, disturbing expression as if he could see me through the page. I asked my friend what they had been told that night, what made them worried when I left with Eduardo. She replied that they were told that some people who went out with him didn't come back. That was said with a tone of mystery, as if in quotes, who knows what they really meant, or if it was part of some macabre game everyone was in on. Perhaps the advice that calling the police would be useless was just another piece of this dark game. I know there's nothing paranormal in this and that it won't scare those who are already used to ghost stories and demonic possessions, but when I remember that dim house, the dogs moving toward me, panting, I relive the greatest horror I've ever felt. Thank you for listening. Sometimes fear can take strange and unsettling forms, don't you think? Forms that seem almost like a game, as if someone enjoyed testing our fears, exploring our trust. Stories like this remind us that danger can hide subtly, that in certain instances it reveals itself in those we least expect. And just when we believe we've escaped, the nagging question remains: did we really get away? Are we truly safe? But there are other encounters where the unknown doesn't hide behind human disguises. It shows itself as it truly is, without subterfuge, as if it wants us to know exactly who or what is on the other side. This next story takes us into a more direct horror, where the inexplicable refuses to hide and the paranormal becomes the only possible explanation. If stories about unexplained presences and shadows that lurk without apparent reason unsettle you, stay tuned, because what comes next will chill your blood. Well, let's continue. Hello, Dom. Fortunately, this story I'm about to tell did not happen to me. I haven't yet had the chance to be the character of such a tale. The protagonist here is my grandmother, who shared this experience with us a few years ago. Only now have I found time to reflect on it, write it down, and share it with you. It all happened a long time ago. My grandmother was born in Michoacán, but when she was still a child, she moved with her parents and siblings to Guanajuato. She was about 16 years old when her Aunt Simone, whom she adored deeply, passed away. The loss of her aunt was a heavy blow to the entire family. As was customary, everyone gathered to pay their last respects and returned to Michoacán for the wake. After the burial, late in the day, the family gathered at Aunt Simone's house for a small memorial gathering, something that has become a tradition in our family. We have always felt the importance of remembering our loved ones with one final gathering after the burial. The village where Aunt Simone lived was small, with unpaved streets and vast plots of land. Her house was spacious but divided into different buildings. The living room, dining room, and one bedroom were in the main building. The kitchen, however, was about 2 meters away in a separate structure. 2 other bedrooms were also detached. My grandmother recalls that the house was filled with religious images and figures, and in the windows there were open scissors, a detail she finds unsettling today. During the gathering in the courtyard, the family shared stories about Aunt Simone, fondly reviving her memory. She was indeed very loved and respected by everyone. In the middle of this gathering, my grandmother noticed something unusual. 3 elderly women were standing in the courtyard of the house across the street. They were very old women, and as she described, their faces were far from friendly. These women had been there since the family arrived, and the most unsettling part was that they didn't look away, though they also didn't utter a word. Their presence gave off a deep feeling of discomfort, as if they were just watching. This fact left my grandmother in a state of unease that was hard to ignore. The house where they were standing seemed abandoned, with old and neglected walls. The yard was overgrown with tall weeds, and the fence looked ready to collapse. Little by little, the unease spread to everyone, creating a heavy atmosphere among those present, as if those women radiated a dark energy. Finally, the family decided to move to the backyard to continue the gathering. One of the aunts, who had cared for Aunt Simone in her final months, mentioned that she had never seen those women, and that, as far as she knew, the house across the way was unoccupied. They tried to ignore the discomfort, assuming perhaps the elderly women were acquaintances of Aunt Simone and were there to pay a last tribute. That same night, most of the family left. My grandmother, however, asked her parents to let her stay an additional week with her cousins to help pack up her aunt's belongings. Even so, on the first night she could hardly sleep. Her cousins were in the detached rooms of the main house, while she chose to sleep in her aunt's old room. Being there alone, surrounded by her Aunt Simone's belongings, stirred a sense of nervousness in her that she couldn't explain. As the days passed, the situation grew increasingly strange. At first, it was just an uncomfortable feeling, as if someone was watching her all the time, even inside the house. But soon after, whispers began. My grandmother recounted that at night, when everything was completely silent, voices would emerge from outside, as if several people were murmuring at the same time. Curiously, these whispers always seemed to come from the house across the street. About 4 days later, her cousins went out to get something to eat, and since my grandmother was the youngest, she stayed behind to continue packing her aunt's belongings. While cleaning, she decided to take some trash bags out to the courtyard. That's when she saw the 3 elderly women again. But this time, something was different. The elderly women seemed younger than she remembered. Their faces, still bearing signs of age, didn't appear as worn, and what caught her attention the most was their unsettling smiles, a disturbing smile that, unlike their eyes, conveyed anger and fury. A chill ran down my grandmother's spine, and she quickly went back inside and locked the door. Later that night, while talking with her cousins, her cousin Amanda mentioned something peculiar. They had also seen the elderly women at the market, but there, they appeared much older, almost unrecognizable compared to the first time they saw them at the house across the street. However, there was no doubt they were the same women, wearing the same clothes. My grandmother froze. How could they have seen them in 2 places at the same time? Additionally, the market was quite far from the village, and it was unlikely those elderly women could move so quickly. That night, after dinner and cleaning up, everyone went to bed. My grandmother preferred to sleep in the living room, as her aunt's room made her uncomfortable. In the early morning, she woke up with an intense thirst. The kitchen was in a separate room at the end of the backyard, which meant she had to go outside and walk a few meters to get there. Heart pounding but determined, she opened the back door. In the dim light from the outdoor lamp, she saw one of the elderly women standing by the fence that bordered the backyard, staring at her. Something about her had changed. The woman seemed younger, appearing around 40, and her posture was straighter, with an intimidating height. Terrified, my grandmother slammed the door shut and rushed back to the couch, where she huddled under the blankets, unable to call for her cousins due to paralyzing fear. Suddenly, she heard loud knocks on the front door. Trembling, she lifted her head from under the blankets and saw, through the window, the pale and terrifying face of one of the elderly women staring at her. It's worth mentioning that at that time, nights in the village were warm, so she usually slept with the window open. After a few knocks, the sound stopped. But the room was filled with murmurs, as if several voices were whispering all at once. Overcome with terror, she gathered the courage and shouted, "You are not allowed to enter. Go back to where you came from." The murmurs turned into a dark chant, a chilling melody. She then remembered her Aunt Simone's words, "Never underestimate the power of faith and the amulets that protect you." My grandmother, trembling and desperate, grabbed a wooden cross and branches hanging over the couch. She held it firmly and began to pray. Gradually, the chants began to fade, but what followed was even more terrifying. From the courtyard, the elderly women began to scream with an inhuman rage, guttural, almost bestial screams. Even after the screams ceased, she didn't stop her prayers, continuing until finally sleep overcame her. That was the last night my grandmother spent in that house. The next morning, she told her cousins what she had experienced. She was scared, and although her cousins did not recall hearing anything, they believed every word. They knew my grandmother was not one to make up stories, and they all agreed that there was something wrong with that house. They decided to leave that very day, packing their things and leaving without looking back. Over time, my grandmother rarely spoke about this experience, always with caution. She never outright called those elderly women witches, but it was clear she believed so. She recounted there was something unnatural about them in their gazes and those impossible apparitions. She never heard anything more about the elderly women, but would say that on rainy days, when the house was completely silent, she could hear distant whispers as if the memories were still standing guard. "There are things we will never understand, my dear," she told me in her most serious tone, which almost sounded like a reprimand. "But sometimes what matters most is not seeking answers, not asking questions we don't want to know. Sometimes what matters most is knowing when to walk away." These words stay with me to this day, a constant reminder that there are mysteries better left unburied, because sometimes the past carries shadows that keep watching us closely, that stay with us forever. Before we move to the next story, if you're enjoying today's tales, please don't forget to leave a like. It really helps the channel a lot. Well, let's continue. Good evening, everyone. My name is Tiago, and today I want to share the story my grandmother, still lucid and full of life at 95, has always told me. She used to say that her mother, born in an isolated village in the mountains of Oaxaca, lived this experience around 1915. At that time, the communities were very small, peaceful, and without access to transportation, with few houses and few people. But there was a unique beauty in the place. It was October 31st, the day believed to be when the Angelitos returned to visit their loved ones. By Angelitos, I mean children who passed away at a very young age, some baptized, others not. They are said to go to limbo, a place where they say they remain in darkness. For this reason, families prepare an offering on the date when they expect their visits. My grandmother's mother, still a girl at that time, was given the task of fetching water early in the morning around 6 o'clock. She took her pitcher to the ditch but ended up taking a long time. Her mother, my great-great-grandmother Teresa Morales, scolded her for the delay. Then the girl explained that while she was at the edge of the ditch filling her pitcher, she saw several children passing by. They were all walking happily, some singing, others praying, but all of them overflowing with joy. The girl hid behind the bushes, uncertain about those unfamiliar figures. She found what she saw strange, but she enjoyed watching how they walked, almost leaping and dancing. So she decided to follow them to see where they were going. To her surprise, she saw them entering houses. Some, however, seemed unable to enter and returned, taking the path that led them back to the trail toward the cemetery. Driven by curiosity, the girl decided to follow one of those who couldn't enter. She walked behind him unnoticed, up to the cemetery entrance. However, when he realized he was being followed, the boy turned around, held the girl's hands in his own, amazingly cold, and murmured, "Then come with me, I don't want to go back alone." The girl tried to break free, but she couldn't pull away. At that moment, a man passed by, leading his donkeys to work, and shouted, "Hey, you there! Let go of that girl, boy!" The boy ran off toward the cemetery, leaving the farmer bewildered, realizing that what he saw wasn't in fact a child, at least not a living child. Trembling, the girl felt an intense cold alongside the farmer, a chill that seemed to reach her bones. She ran back home without even managing to thank the man, and only once she was safe did she share what she had experienced. So, friends, that's exactly why we place so many sweets, bread, chocolate, soda, a glass of water, and other foods on the altar, along with candles that light the path to welcome the Angelitos. And the next day, the faithful departed. Never pray to the dead, friends. And to be more specific, avoid especially doing it at dawn as I did. The church priest warned me, asking for something in prayer is, in itself, already risky. He advised that I just talk to them, tell them about my life. But today I want to share what happened when I disobeyed and made a request. and who ended up answering. When I lost my mother, my dear Marissa, I entered one of the darkest phases of my life. I sank into a deep depression, a loneliness that left me aimless. Despite being 35 years old, my routine had always revolved around the store, the church, and taking care of her. And then, suddenly, I found myself without anything that truly gave meaning to my life. Luckily, I still had the store, our source of livelihood since my childhood. But, as they say, misfortune never comes alone. Just weeks after losing my mother, Mr. Anselmo's stationery store on the corner was demolished to quickly make way for one of those big display stores, just like so many others out there. That's when I realized that the end of my little store was closer than I imagined. Those were days of despair. I cried watching that construction progress at full speed without giving me time to prepare. In just 15 days, they were already operating, and customers started disappearing. It was then, on one of those nights, that I began to pray to my mother. I spoke to her, asked that, if she was nearby and could hear me, she would help me. I just had no idea what would come next. After several nights praying to my mother, something began to change. The house no longer felt the same. The feeling of loneliness disappeared, but it didn't bring peace. On the contrary, my body, my mind, my heart began to feel a constant alert, a disturbing presence. On one of those early mornings, I sat in front of the small image of the Virgin that my mother always venerated. The room was silent, with the candles nearly burnt out when I felt a peculiar chill, a cold that didn't come from outside but from within, as if something had penetrated my soul, a desperate sensation. I can't say how long I stayed there until I heard a whisper. At first I thought it was a delusion, maybe my grief-stricken mind playing tricks on me. But the whisper continued, the unintelligible words growing stronger in my head. Here I am, here I am, here I am, was what I finally understood. And then I recognized the voice. It was my mother's. My heart was flooded with a mix of relief and fear, a brief relief, for I quickly realized that it wasn't her. It couldn't be, and I knew it. It went against everything I believed. In the days that followed, that presence I initially thought would be comforting became increasingly intrusive. Every night, noises would arise in empty rooms, things would move, faucets would turn on by themselves. I even heard the bathroom flush, as if something wanted to manifest using all possible noises to make itself noticed. The whispers became clearer. My mother's voice emerged in the darkness, turning into increasingly intense and disturbing murmurs, as if ordering me to keep praying, to keep asking for her help. One night I heard footsteps coming from the store. Summoning courage, I went down with a candle in hand, and deep inside I already knew it wasn't a thief. When I got there, I found products scattered, thrown from one side to the other as if someone had angrily passed through, knocking everything over. In the mirror in front of the counter, which we used to see down the corridor, I noticed a strange glow, something that moved too quickly to be just a shadow. But what scared me the most was seeing that amidst the chaos, the picture of my mother, which I had brought from home to keep her always present in the store, remained standing on the counter, untouched, but with a different expression, almost a slight smile. The last time I prayed to her was the worst of all. No longer knowing what to do, I begged for a sign, anything. All I wanted was proof that it was really her, so I could continue praying in peace without fear. I said that I was terrified and asked her to show me it was truly her, so I could trust. Then I felt it. A cold hand rested on my shoulder. I was paralyzed, unable to move, and I heard her voice again, clear, close, as if she was right beside me. But this time my beloved mother said something I never imagined I'd hear. "No, I'm not your mother." Whatever had been answering my prayers was not my mother. When I heard that voice again, I realized it was all just a macabre trap, something sinister that used my pain, my anguish, my loneliness, and my grief to feed itself. And when I realized that, it was already too late. Since then, I am no longer alone in this house. There is something here, something that doesn't want to leave, something that feeds on my despair. I can no longer sleep or pray. All I have left is to wait, because I feel that at some point it will come for me. It's curious, But the sadder I become, the closer this presence seems to be. In the past few weeks, I've been selling more stationery items, things the big store on the corner doesn't offer, taking advantage of the fact that Mr. Anselmo's stationery shop was removed. The sales have helped me think that, at least, there won't be a lack of food, and with this new sense of relief I realize that I feel less of that thing around me, that thing that pretends to be my mother, the one I once invoked and now don't know how to expel. The priest helps me, but deep down I know he doesn't entirely believe me. So friends, if one day you feel tempted to ask something from your dead, remember my words. They are not listening. Something else is, something that lurks, just waiting for a chance, and once that door opens, there's no way to close it. Good evening, everyone. Since forever, the paranormal world has fascinated me. Throughout my life, I've had some paranormal experiences, though most were isolated events. Seen individually, they might even seem mundane, shadows in the corner of the eye, sounds at home that no one can explain. But today, I chose to share with you the most intense experience I've ever had. Something that truly lasted long minutes, maybe hours, with a presence that I'm not even sure belongs to our world. This story happened a few years ago, about 4, and only now do I feel prepared to tell it. It was early 2020, the beginning of February, if my memory serves me. At that time, we weren't yet in lockdown due to the pandemic, but COVID was already known in Mexico. We were living as if everything was normal, as if it would never reach us. I live in the city of Querétaro, and during that phase of my life I was studying for my degree at the Autonomous University of Querétaro, or UAQ. This information is important because the locations I'll mention are highly relevant, even for those unfamiliar with the city. If you like, I recommend looking up the streets on Google Maps to better follow along. It all started on a seemingly ordinary day. My classes started in the afternoon, with nothing special happening. In the middle of the afternoon, we were informed that the last 2 classes would be cancelled. So instead of leaving at 7 in the evening, we'd be free a bit before 8. When the last class of the day ended, it was around 7:50. As usual, I waited for my best friend so we could say goodbye or do something together, making the most of the early end, as we sometimes did. Outside the classroom, we exchanged that look of mutual understanding, and he immediately suggested, "How about a beer? It's still early, right?" I agreed without a second thought. My best friend lived just a few minutes from the university since, being from another city, he rented an apartment near campus, specifically on José Martí Street, almost at the corner with Ezequiel Montes. Those who know Querétaro know it's about a 10-minute walk. So we headed to his apartment, and along the way we each bought a beer. At the time, a light beer with lime and salt, around 2% alcohol, had just been released, and that's exactly what we chose. I mention this because I strongly believe that what happened next can in no way be attributed to the effect of alcohol. Between the walk from the university and the beer stop, we arrived at his apartment around 8:15. While we drank, the conversation flowed as typical for college students, professors, assignments, projects, and everything else. I finished my beer, glanced at my phone, and noticed it was almost 9 o'clock. I mentioned to my friend that I should leave soon to take advantage of the early hour and avoid crowded or delayed buses later on. We said goodbye. I went down to the gate, and when I started walking and checked my phone again, it was just past 9 at night. I walked down José Martí Street and turned right onto Ezequiel Montes, heading to the bus stop on Zaragoza Avenue. While walking along Ezequiel Montes, something began to feel strange. Although it was relatively early and I was near the center, the streets were almost empty. This stretch is usually bustling at this hour, so it caught my attention. The few people I crossed paths with were unusual. They didn't exactly look like ghosts, but they didn't seem like the type of people coming from work or other commitments either. Some were just standing there with a lost look, dirty clothes, and some seemed a bit out of it. I thought maybe they were homeless, which is common downtown, often wandering, whether from hunger or under some influence. The lonely streets and the fact that I wasn't in a hurry made me not check my phone again, but given the proximity of my friend's apartment to the bus stop, I estimate I must have reached Zaragoza Avenue around 9:10. Those familiar with the area will know the stop I'm talking about, the one by the Templo de Santa Rosa de Viterbo. It was there that I felt something truly strange. The stop was completely empty. There wasn't a single person besides me, an unusual sight since there's usually a decent number of people waiting for transport there at any time. I looked around and had the strange impression that the city was completely empty. No vehicles passed, no cars, no buses. In my mind, I thought, it must still be very early since the few times I'd waited at this stop, it was past 10 at night when there were always several people waiting. I usually took the bus from another spot at the UAQ stop on Highway 5 de Febrero. Not giving much thought to the situation, I decided to wait calmly for any bus that could drop me off on 5 de Febrero for a transfer. Even better if one came that would take me closer to home. After a few minutes, I noticed someone approaching from the corner of my eye. I turned my head and indeed a man was walking toward me. I didn't pay much attention and went back to looking for buses, hoping one would soon arrive. That's when the man stopped next to me and asked, "What are you doing here alone?" I stayed calm as I'm not easily scared. I've been through enough that I don't usually get unnerved, and after all, keeping calm is always better, especially when you don't know if the other person has questionable intentions. I turned to observe him more closely. He looked like an ordinary person, slightly disheveled, about my height, around 30 years old, dark-skinned, short hair, and a somewhat rugged appearance. I replied, "Nothing much, just waiting for the bus. And you?" Then the man gave me a smile that was unsettling, not exactly frightening, but inexplicably disturbing. What threw me off wasn't the smile itself, but his teeth. The best way to describe them would be to say he had shark teeth, all sharp like a row of canines, all identical and pointed. They seemed carved like that, as if he'd undergone some body modification, similar to tongue splitting. That's how his teeth were. Having no idea of the man's intentions or whether he was fully sane, I chose not to show any sign of fear or discomfort, out of respect and caution. So, I simply waited for him to respond. After that strange smile showing his bizarre teeth, he said, "I'm looking for someone to keep me company. Want to come with me?" I replied no, that I was just waiting for the bus to go home, and I looked at the road as if to end the conversation. We stayed silent for a few seconds, and the street remained deserted. He resumed speaking, now in a more casual tone. "I was at a party, drinking with a girl who was on my lap, but I ran out of money. So, I decided to leave. I thought to myself, what does that have to do with me? But it wasn't the time to be rude to such a strange person, especially with the street completely empty. So I simply agreed. That's a shame. It happens." He smiled again, once more exposing those strange teeth. Then he asked, "Do I look drunk?" "No, you seem fine," I replied. That's when he got very close, beyond what would be comfortable, and said, "You can smell my breath. See if I smell of alcohol." And he opened his mouth as if to ensure I looked closely at those horrible teeth. I took a step back and said, "I don't think I'll be able to tell. I also just drank, so I wouldn't smell the alcohol." As I spoke, I thought to myself, this guy must be insane thinking I'd smell his breath. The man, with that strange smile, closed his mouth and suggested, "Well, let's do this. I'll invite you for a drink and I'll get us some girls." "No, thank you, I need to get home," I replied, suspecting he wanted something more. He'd just said he was out of money, yet now he was inviting me out. It didn't make sense. Silence filled the air again, and there was still no one around, not even cars. I just wanted a bus to come soon to get me away from this guy. "So, you're not coming with me?" he asked, breaking the silence. I answered firmly, "No, I'm going home." I looked around and finally a bus was approaching. I didn't even check the route. All I wanted was to get out of there, even if I had to get off at the next stop. I signaled to the bus, and the stranger asked, "Is this your bus?" I simply replied, "Yes, I'm going, bye." I thought the strange events would end there, but the night had more surprises in store. I got on the bus, and when I tried to validate my prepaid card, I realized there was no reader. I spoke to the driver, explaining that I only had the card, no cash, and he replied that it was fine, I could sit down. The bus was almost empty, only 5 other people besides the driver and me. However, looking at the other passengers, it seemed like the bus was full of homeless people, with all due respect. Their clothes were torn, dirty, and many looked disoriented. One man, who seemed around 50 years old, was extremely thin, almost just skin and bone, twisting himself strangely. I quickly assumed he might be under the influence of something. I decided not to pay any more attention and thought, I'll get off as soon as I can. The bus went down Zaragoza Avenue, and I planned to get off at the corner with 5 de Febrero. However, when we passed that stop, I noticed it was also empty, which made me decide to stay on the bus until the UAQ stop, where there were usually many people due to the end of classes. I'd feel safer there, among a familiar crowd. To my surprise, upon arrival, the stop was completely deserted. I figured it might still be a bit early, and students hadn't yet come out, as most usually left around 10 o'clock. By my calculations, it couldn't be past 9:30. I'd arrived at the Templo de Santa Rosa de Viterbo stop around 9:10, adding the brief conversation with that guy and the 10 minutes on the bus. It certainly couldn't be later than 9:30. I decided not to get off, but then I realized I didn't actually know the final destination of the bus. I could have asked the driver, but I was already feeling a bit confused, so I stood up, prepared to get off at the next stop. Finally, I exited the bus on 5 de Febrero at the corner with Avenida Universidad. Once again, I was shocked to see the stop completely empty, and this stop is always full of people waiting, as it's an industrial area where many workers catch buses at the end of their shifts. I no longer knew what to think, but seeing some cars passing on the road brought me some relief. I waited about 5 minutes and the bus didn't come. Suddenly a car passed and then reversed until it stopped right beside me. The passenger window began to lower and I thought, what now? Who's in there? When the window lowered completely, someone called me by name. I leaned down slightly to see who was driving and heard my name again, along with the question of what I was doing there. To my surprise, it was one of my cousins, who lives close to where I live. "Oh, sorry, I didn't recognize your car," I said with a nervous smile. She told me to get in, that she'd give me a ride home. Already inside the car, she asked what I was doing there so late. According to her, the buses didn't even pass anymore at that hour. I replied, "What do you mean? I left early. There are still buses. They only stop running at 10:30. She looked at me strangely without saying anything and pointed to the car's clock. It was 11:40. In disbelief and with an increasingly awkward smile, I insisted that her clock must be wrong, as it was at most 9:40. I was sure of it. By my calculations, not even an hour had passed since I'd left my friend's place. My cousin, still confused, replied, "I left work at 11 and even stayed a while talking to a friend. How could it be 9:40? That made perfect sense. After all, it's true that my cousin on the afternoon shift leaves work at 11 at night. I quickly took out my phone and confirmed. It was already past 11:40. I saw several missed calls from my mum. Still trying to process what was happening, another call from her came in. She wanted to know how I was, where I was going, and why I hadn't answered. Not really knowing what to say and to avoid getting into details about something I didn't even understand, I replied that I was with a friend, that time had flown, and I hadn't noticed the calls, but that I was already with my cousin and not to worry. As soon as I hung up, my cousin looked at me and commented, "Oh, see? You weren't coming from school. I bet you were out having fun." I still couldn't grasp how I had lost 2 hours of my night, so I just said I spent some time with a friend and took a while to catch the bus. Apparently, she didn't believe me or sense the confusion on my face, as she soon asked again if I was okay. Finally, she dropped me off at home nearly midnight. I said goodbye, went in and tried to leave it all behind. In my mind, I thought that maybe I had left my friend's place later, which would explain the empty city and make everything easier to rationalize. But, to clear any doubts, the next day, I asked my friend if he remembered what time I left, and he confirmed. I did leave at 9. I know this story isn't the most terrifying, but there's something very strange about it that leaves me with many questions. Who were those odd people? And that man with sharp teeth, who or what was he? Where did he really want to take me, and what happened to those 2 hours that somehow vanished from my time? Was I with beings from another plane, or did I, for some reason, momentarily cross over to another one? I'd love to hear what you think in the comments. Thank you all for listening, and I send you a hug, wishing you an excellent night. But above all, I urge you to be very careful the next time you go out at night and notice the streets eerily deserted. Yasmin and I have been together for 10 years, and 2 years ago we decided to get married. Recently, less than a month ago, we bought a new house, but the move didn't go exactly as planned. We went to a small town in rural Georgia called Waycross. These are the details I can share to avoid possible complications. Our house is on a quiet street, on a large property right across from a wooded area. One of the features that caught our attention the most. We want to adopt a dog and raise children here, so having outdoor space for them to play was essential. Our work schedules are similar. I get home around 5, while she usually arrives around 6 on most days. The first nights were completely normal. Since it was the weekend, we spent the days unpacking everything. On Monday night, about 20 minutes after we turned off the lights, we heard loud music coming from the backyard. It couldn't have been the neighbors. They're far enough away that any sound from there wouldn't be heard here. It was definitely coming from our backyard. The music wasn't lively or festive. It was an old melody with a vintage sound and full of static. With the windows closed, Yasmin and I exchanged a scared look, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. I opened the window on my side of the bed, and it became clear. It was a song from the 1940s, something I later discovered after looking up the lyrics, called "Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf?", performed by Henry Hall. For some reason, this music has a strange vibe, even though it's meant to be a cheerful song. But, coming from our backyard, the feeling was one of pure discomfort. We were still getting used to the house, but I assumed there had to be a switch for the backyard lights downstairs. I went down to the back door and tested the switches near it, and one of them lit up the yard. There was no one in sight. I opened the door, and the sound became even clearer. I walked across the grass and then realized that the music wasn't exactly in the backyard, but was coming from the forest. It kept playing while I was there, standing and looking around. As soon as the music ended, everything went silent. It seemed like a bad taste welcome prank, but I didn't find it funny at all. When I got back inside, I told my wife it was probably some kids trying to pull a prank on the new residents for whatever reason. As soon as I said that, I realized how ridiculous and strange that explanation sounded. Who would do something like that? The next night, the scene repeated. Shortly after we turned off the lights in the bedroom, the music started again, louder than before. This time it was a song everyone knows, "Tiptoe Through the Tulips." Yasmin and I exchanged looks again, now with a mixture of worry and disgust. We had hoped it was an isolated incident, but it was happening again. I looked out the window and noticed something on the grass this time. It didn't look like a person, but there was definitely something there. I told my wife I was going to check it out. She suggested calling the police, and I replied that we'd do that in a second. I went out with the feeling that I needed to show who was in charge, both for my wife and for anyone thinking they could intimidate us just because we were new in the neighborhood. When I reached the yard, I saw that the object on the grass was smaller than I'd thought, but the shrill, disturbing music was coming from it. It was an old radio. I turned off the device and looked at the window, where my wife was watching, lifting it to show her and shouting that someone had left it there to scare us with that music. What she did next totally caught me off guard. She started yelling my name, telling me to run inside. She kept screaming, "Run!" I asked, "Why?" And she replied in the middle of her screams, "There are people behind you." When I heard that, I felt my heart race and quickly turned toward the forest. I could see 3 figures standing about 2 meters apart from each other, all facing me. They weren't running toward me, they were just standing there. I muttered, "Oh crap," and dashed back inside, slamming the door shut behind me. My wife was already upstairs, crying uncontrollably. I said I would call the police and grabbed the phone. They arrived, thankfully it didn't take long. While we waited, we feared hearing any knocking on the doors or windows. As soon as the officers entered, we explained everything, still very shaken, and I showed them the radio that was on the ground. I asked them to take the device as evidence, to collect fingerprints, and informed them I had only touched the handle. They took the radio with them. They checked the front of the forest with their flashlights for a few minutes, probably to scare off anyone who might still be there. After they left, we felt somewhat helpless and insecure, but thank God those people never appeared again. This happened only a few weeks ago. God forbid they come back. And if it happens, I'll try to record a video.